Our journey begins. It's day 56, July 26, 2024. And if I can, I'm going to try to explore ideas for the scene for the first narrative and perhaps some of the other narratives, but mostly just the first narrative. I don't want to get stuck on this, but I think I'll at least try exploring different scene ideas. For some reason, it's just been a tough thing to think of a really good scene, but it's an absolutely beautiful morning. There are so many crickets. There's a beautiful moon that's a little over half full, and so the scene is moonlit around me. It's beautiful. So what scene ideas? I guess I'm just going to start mind mapping possible scene ideas, and then maybe we'll figure something out. I've just been coming to think more and more that there's a decent solution to every problem. There's no you don't really ever have to settle for a bad solution to a problem. There's always a decent solution. So in this case, a decent solution would look something like a scene which is very interesting, exciting, and perfectly sort of represents all the stories that are going to come down the road. Because this is sort of like an earlier narrative, and yeah, so I think it's somewhat essential to sort of kick things off properly. And so yeah, what would be interesting ideas? I think perhaps some sort of exploration. See, I think it's partially because I've confined what my story is supposed to do to the point where I can't really be creative with the scene. But I think that's a false dichotomy. I think I can come up with a creative scene and interweave what I actually want to talk about, and then combining the two would be something completely unique, and that's what we want. So yeah, I guess I'll just think of interesting scenes in general. So the idea of the movement is envisioning a better world, envisioning the most magnificent of futures possible, of that's one of the core ideas. So a possible scene could be something like the person. So basically, the plot of the first narrative is that a person was entrenched in their ways because of the way they grew up, and they just sort of believed what they had believed, and they thought it to be the right thing to believe. And because of that, they were really hurting other people. And then finally they realized that, oh, they were wrong. And then at first they could not possibly switch their belief system because that would mean that they were wrong. And that was too great of a cost. And so they just got further entrenched that they were on the right side. But then eventually something happened where like it was sort of personal. Like they ended up having to like hurt someone personal or something, and at that point they just broke down and were like they just couldn't keep doing things just to prove that they were right when they had realized that really they were wrong. That there was new information that they had to take into account, or there was just information that they had to take into account that they had previously disregarded as incorrect, not because it was incorrect, but because their belief system would not allow them to see it. So that's the general premise. I mean, you could have this in various senses. Perhaps this person went around, or like, see now I'm trying to think through what components of a possible world you would really want. As in, like, do I want to set up the scene? Because I think that the world building is going to be fairly consistent throughout the short stories, but not necessarily in the way that, like, oh, they all take place on one individual planet, but that they all take place in the same general universe. But I think that this universe is going to be very unique. So maybe in the first story, I should introduce the idea of like many alternate universes and many different types of universes to explore. Which the problem with all of that is that, okay, that's a cool idea, but then people can't relate to that, or people are gonna not be able to draw metaphorical comparisons with their own life if it's too abstract. So my main idea was that it should be like a metaphorical world in general. Yeah, I think that's possible. Like in Narnia, for example, it's basically a metaphorical world. But it's like totally interesting concept. But you're easily able to determine extrapolations because it's humans are the main characters, and so even though it's and the humans are coming from the same, like they're exploring a different world, but they're exploring it as though it is a different world. But then, yeah, I guess I just wonder. Anyway, so yeah, you could maybe I just need to think of general world building stuff then. Like in general, what world is this whole, are these short stories going to take place in? And then if I have a general idea of that, then it's probably easier to create an actual scene on that world. So yeah, I could imagine like a world where there's like bridges to all these alternate worlds, and perhaps the main character, didn't want to believe that there were all these other worlds. They only wanted to live in their own world, and they believed that all the other worlds were bad, and so they would purposely Like, I don't know if they would like go to war with these other worlds, but they would have convinced themselves that they were in the right and they were like protecting humanity or something like that. Yeah, that would be interesting because then you could explore all these different types of worlds. Yeah, I mean, in general, I'm not sure, but you could potentially explore the idea, which I thought a little bit through this when I did the epic virtual reality adventure around day 30, 33 or day 35. And where essentially like there was this like bridge to all these various virtual worlds, and those characters were testing out the very first virtual world, but then my virtual reality adventure kind of fell through because I was imagining it was going to be all cool and everything, but then it ended up that the characters wanted to just live in the real world. They didn't want to live in a virtual world. So yeah, but like you could potentially explore. See, I don't know. I feel like the first story should not be in a world where it should be very similar to our world. And I think that way, because I think that's how it should be. It should, in general, the short stories should show how you could actually go from like our present conditions to a much better world. So, but if you start with and you're sort of missing the gap. So I think the first story, maybe it should be very much similar, perhaps still metaphorical, but similar, very similar to our Earth in our current state, and perhaps the metaphorical world should just be that, where it's sort of the same, or it's sort of, yeah, a world which you can metaphorically associate with Earth, which I'm not exactly sure what that means. I think what I'm trying to say is so like on Earth we have all these problems. We have, because the second narrative is going to be that it's also going to be a sort of metaphorical look at how confusing Earth is. The first story is going to be basically looking at how really we can't know anything about Earth to be true. I just think that's an essential starting point. And so, but then I was thinking about this, and I wasn't convinced that you could do that, because if you do any particular thing, but I guess, yeah, it's complicated, because if you do something that most people know is the wrong thing to do, but like the character in the book thinks it's the right thing to do, and then eventually they realize, oh, that was the wrong thing to do. Like, that is not relatable to most people, because they would have been like, oh, but obviously that was the wrong thing to do. And like, obviously I'm not doing that. So it has to be something where you actually trick the reader into thinking that that is the right thing to do. Then you expose it as not being the right thing to do. But for the most part, we've pretty much ironed out. Like, we don't really have problems with that. And like, really, you do want to be thinking about, like, I don't know. In general, most smart people are generally believing the approximate right things. But then if that's the case, then why am I even doing this as the first story? I think there are a lot of people who just assume different things, like, it's not possible to change the world, like, like they're just gonna live their life and that's about it. Like, they could never make a difference, that sort of thing. Maybe I should just do that. I should just tell the story of a normal person who's living a normal life in the world that, like, most developed people would consider a normal life. There's only like a small percentage of people who, I guess, actually that's true. Like, almost every person in the entire world does not think like me in terms of, oh, like, I'm literally, like, I would be happy sacrificing my entire life, all of my happiness, everything, to just help end suffering a little bit. Whereas, like, most people are like, they want to please their family, they want to have a family, to make themselves happy and all that stuff. And basically it's mostly a selfish ambitions. So maybe I'll start with that, like, thinking through normal selfish ambitions type of attitude, and sort of showcase that as like, but they want to like do certain things, and so you're kind of on their team. You're kind of like, oh yeah, that maybe that's the way I should be. And then you realize, and then it's exposed that, and then I deliver my expositions that, like, literally challenged me with the movement. Like, okay, but what if all of that is wrong? And why am I actually believing that to be the case? And so that could work. So that's basically, because I think making it too abstract isn't going to work. This is a core idea of the movement of being able to at all times be open-minded and not convince yourself that great things are not possible. And so I guess in that case, but then I feel like it would be a little bit boring potentially, because then it would just be like a normal scene. Like, who wants to read a normal book? It has to be particularly interesting, which is why I was thinking of the ideas of like exploring completely new, unique, imaginative worlds. I guess you could make it a little bit unique by having someone particularly interesting. Someone who you're on their side because they're developing some new technology, or they're like, maybe they're living a normal life, but then they're given, or they're, I don't know. Because if it's just normal life, I'm not necessarily that good at making that sort of thing romantic and interesting. But yeah, I don't know, I do think that is probably the right way to go. But if it's mostly completely boring, then I could just make it part of the appendix and not make it like the first story. I just feel like the first story, I guess maybe the stories don't have to go in order. Maybe the idea of like the sequential sort of presenting or like telling a story, and that would sort of be in a certain order. But maybe I could still do that, but it wouldn't necessarily be in a particular order. I don't know. I don't think that's possible though. Yeah, I think it makes the most sense to have a particular order. That way, like, it can be interesting from like the standpoint of it being like an actual book. So yeah, maybe the story is mostly written from around now time frame, and then it moves into the future, and it's sort of parables of the future. Yeah, and the sort of like narratives of the future, like possible narratives to imagine, because that is basically what it is. Which that would be consistent with my original way of doing a movement founding book. Just sort of thinking of things, of like exploring a possible future. Yeah. I guess it could still be interesting in like a mind-blowing way, of like simply that whole idea of like, why are you assuming that? Why are you assuming this thing which ends up hurting most other people? Like, why are you assuming that like the country you were born into was the right country? And I guess it could still be very impactful, even if it's not like super imaginative or anything. It could be just super impactful and like getting people to completely challenge their way of thinking. And I'm sure that there's other books that do that try to do that. In which case, like, my book would not be unique. So I guess I still don't want to completely give up on the interesting world type thing. So there have to be some element of that, like of interesting world building, or like a very particularly interesting scene, something like that, which wouldn't have to be exactly the way Earth is now. Like maybe the first story is like Earth in like 5 years in some really interesting technology is developed, and the person is using that technology, and maybe that technology itself is supposed to expose your beliefs and how they're wrong or something like that. That could be somewhat interesting. Like, you basically live in like a double world. Or like a digital twin type of situation. Maybe yeah, I guess that's okay. I'll still try to make it vastly interesting and explore some ideas, but I'll just make it like really challenging for people and really challenging the way they think about everything. Even the way that they think about what's good and bad and basically everything. Really break that down right at the beginning so that we can explore ideas. Okay, what is the solution? Yeah, I think it could still be a very much of like a tragedy and very much get the reader interested to read more, even if it's not totally exploratory. But then as you keep reading through the stories, it starts like becoming way more interesting than you even thought possible. And I guess that's true as well. It's sort of like a normal-ish story, but very, very sad and interesting, and you want to keep reading through the stories. But then it like completely transforms into something like you wouldn't have even thought the story would have ever gone to. I do like that sort of thing. So I guess that's true. Plus, if it's a short story, like 7.5 minutes, it's not going to take that long to even go through the story. I don't know. I really don't know if 7.5 minute story is even potentially possible. But okay, well, I guess I did actually make a lot of progress. At first I was just gonna try to like walk and like just think about it, but I think it's better to be talking it out because it forces you to keep thinking and to follow through on what you're saying and make coherent sentences, which sort of forces you to think through the solutions. All right, thanks.